When discussing fiction, and fantasy in particular, we often use terms like lore to discuss world building and canon to refer to the lore that is official and true. However, have you ever wondered why these terms in particular, and how they came to be used in such a way today? Let's find out. The word lore comes from the Old English lar, meaning instruction or teaching. Essentially, the collection of knowledge or wisdom that is passed down through the generations. Lore is something that describes information that transcends the ages and accumulates over lengthy periods of time. Therefore, in the proper use of the word, when referring to the lore of the ancient Greeks, you would be describing their unique wisdom and experiences, not simply their history, as the modern use of the term in fiction may imply. This is important to keep in mind, as nowadays, lore in The Lord of the Rings, for example, would be you knowing the background of Sauron or the Nazgul. Instead, think of the original use that Tolkien made of the word. J.R.R. Tolkien would refer to the elf lore or the dwarf lore, a one-to-one with our ancient Greek example from before, but we'll come back to Tolkien shortly. In the mid-1800s, English writer William Thoms was the one who first put together the word lore, referring to ancient wisdom, and the word folk, in reference usually to the common people. Thus, he created the word folklore to specifically describe the traditional wisdom of the commoners, and by and large, the peasants. In the years since, the word folk gradually shifted to describing different social groups or units of family. But the word folklore nonetheless retains the original substance of generational wisdom inherent in lore. Writers such as William Morris and especially Lord Dunsany likewise used lore in its traditional context, and these two were perhaps the most influential figures in J.R.R. Tolkien's writing journey. Ultimately, it was the incredible popularity of The Lord of the Rings, and especially the products that it inspired, that lore gradually shifted from traditional popular wisdom to the backstory of a fictional universe. In the original Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax would refer to lore still as something handed down over time, though in this case with a specifically arcane connotation. Eventually, lore was increasingly used as synonymous to information connected to the world itself, until ultimately gaining a position in the game's mechanics too. For example, a spell such as Legend Lore would allow you to learn forgotten information about specific things, therefore providing world building to them. Then in the 1980s and especially the 90s, once larger scale official campaign settings were introduced, they would come with their own necessary histories and legends. This historical flavor and much needed world building background came to be described as lore, and this process reached its height in the early 2000s, with even more specified lore section provided to dungeon masters. From then on, D&D would use the word lore specifically in reference to world information, and no longer as traditional popular wisdom. Lore took a similar turn in other popular franchises from both video games and other board games, including The Elder Scrolls and Warhammer. In private developer notes, artists and writers began to refer to world building as lore, and the term had gradually changed its meaning, both on the creator's side, but also on behalf of the fan communities. Therefore, what essentially started with Tolkien in its original meaning, and was carried on by Dungeons & Dragons, and through its own popularity, eventually shifted and became what it is today. And in fact, the popularity of this fantasy media may have fundamentally impacted the wider meaning of the word lore, as more and more people correlate it to world building as opposed to ancient wisdom. Speaking of fan communities and fantasy, however, what about the term canon? Nowadays, we use the word canon to decide which part of the lore is actually official and intended to be true by the writer or creator of a certain product. Originally, the term was used in a very similar but simultaneously very different way. You see, canon comes from the ancient Greek kanon, which essentially means rule in our context. The original and perhaps most famous and influential use of the Greek kanon, which became canon in English much later on, was the biblical canon. Essentially, the canon referred to the specific scripture which was agreed to make up the Old and New Testaments. As you can imagine, especially when the New Testament was first emerging, there were a lot of documents around whose origins were suspicious to say the least. These were examined and either accepted or rejected based on the criteria and evidence available. Thus, the canon scripture of the New Testament was decided to be the 27 books we have today, while documents such as the Gospel of Thomas and Peter or the infancy Gospels were rejected and not included in the canon of Scripture. Naturally, there were a lot of diverging ideas as to how strict the canonicity of Scripture should be between East and West, and the Protestant Reformation added to the complexity of the biblical canon, but I digress. The point is that the term had a religious connotation and referred to something that was authoritative. It is this last part of authority, and essentially officiality, that took the term from religion and brought it over to literature. One of the very first and definitely most popular early uses of the term canon in literature was with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his work on Sherlock Holmes. Doyle had produced 56 short stories and 4 novels, which made up the official Sherlock Holmes stories. Considering the immense popularity of the character, however, there were a lot of fan activity and Sherlock Holmes stories that grew in popularity but were not authored by Doyle himself. This necessitated the use of a term to differentiate the general Sherlock Holmes content and the character's official adventures that captured the full intention of the author himself. Sherlock Holmes fan and writer, as well as priest, Ronald Knox, took inspiration from Christian history and applied the term canon to this issue, thus coining the Sherlock Holmes canon. Everything within it, meaning the 60 stories written by Doyle, were canon and official, while everything without it was not. While the term may have been used in a similar way for another piece of media, this was certainly one of the most famous early cases of a fan community using the term over 100 years ago. This was then taken on and made even more famous by the communities of Star Trek and Star Wars, and from then on, it was applied more generally across all entertainment media. Naturally, there is some debate as to when canon itself is actually true. For example, while The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are canon because their final form was published with Tolkien's approval, The Silmarillion is more controversial. Tolkien would rewrite it again and again throughout his life, and its current form was not published with his blessing, as he had unfortunately passed away. Both the Silmarillion and the large number of other posthumous material edited and published by his son Christopher. Moreover, what if an author has passed away, but their publisher gives their approval for another book in the same universe to another author? Does the legal authority of the publisher as copyright holder trump the creative rights of an author who has died? And what about Star Wars and its original canon, which was essentially reset and replaced by Disney's own canon lore? I think I'll leave these more philosophical questions up to you. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.